A 14-year-old just destroyed a $4 billion empire. 9 moves, not a gun, not a lawyer, not a single dollar in his pocket. It's a chess piece worn smooth by a dead man's hands. The billionaire laughed first. 200 guests laughed with him. Someone threw a $20 bill on the floor. Because that's what you do when you've already decided the other person is nothing. 63,000 strangers watched it happen live. Nobody was laughing at move 6. Nobody was breathing at move 9. The room had been his for 30 years. Then it wasn't. One word. Quiet as a confession. Final as a verdict. Checkmate. The first thing you hear is silence. Not the comfortable kind. Not the silence of a room winding down at the end of a long evening. The kind that happens when 200 people stop breathing at the same moment because something on a table in front of them has just overturned everything they thought they understood about the night. A boy, 14 years old, a jacket that belonged to someone else before it belonged to him. He reaches into his pocket and sets something down on a $50,000 chessboard. A small wooden king. The crown has been smoothed by decades of someone else's patience. The sound it makes when it touches the board is almost nothing. The word that follows is quiet, too. Checkmate. Said the way you say something that was always going to be true. The way you say something the board already knew before anyone in the room was willing to admit it. 11 weeks before that moment, Elias Kardos was sitting on a stool in a kitchen that wasn't his, reading a library book, waiting for his mother to finish work. Same as always. That part matters because the story of how everything changed begins not with something dramatic, but with something ordinary. A boy on a stool, a library book open on his lap, the specific quiet of a house that belongs to someone else and makes sure you know it from the moment you walk through the service entrance. There are rooms that make you feel small when you walk into them, not because of anything anyone says. Not yet, just the ceilings, the height of them. The way sound moves differently when everything surrounding you costs more than your mother earns in a year. Elias Carter had understood that feeling before he had a name for it. He was 14, thin as a fence post, eyes that tracked everything without appearing to track anything, and a mouth that offered almost nothing back. He had been coming to the Harwell estate since he was 8 years old, sitting in the staff kitchen with a library book on his lap, waiting for the day to end. He knew which floorboards creaked in the east hallway. He knew the refrigerator in the staff kitchen hum louder after 9 in the evening. He knew the study door stuck in humid weather and had to be not pushed, and that if you pushed it, you would stand there for an embarrassing moment before understanding your mistake. He knew all of this the way you know things when no one is watching you learn them, because no one ever watched Elias Carter. That was the arrangement. That was the point. Richard Harwell was 56 old, silver at the temples, with a jaw that had been handsome onces and had settled over the years into something harder and less interested in being like, the kind of face that made people choose their words before speaking them. He had $4 billion under management at Harwell Capital. He had a 12-spring branch that he had purchased not because he needed 12 beds, but because the man he outbid had needed not to lose it. And Harwell had understood the difference between those two motivations and exploited it without hesitation. He had a garage of cars he didn't drive, and a cellar of wine he mostly didn't open, and a chessboard in his study that had cost $50,000, and had never, in 20 years of dinner parties and late evenings and guests who fancied themselves players, lost a single game. That last part mattered most to him. People who didn't know Richard Harwell assumed the chess was recreational. People who knew him understood it was something else, a language. The only one he spoke without first running it through the filter of how it would land, what it would cost, whether it served the larger purpose. At the chessboard, he was simply himself. And himself, it turned out, was very good at chess. Here is what the newspapers said about Richard Harwell over the years. Shark, visionary, self-made. Here is what the newspapers left out. He grew up in Cincinnati, son of a welder who worked double shifts and still couldn't keep the heat reliable in February. He had worn the same pair of shoes through 2 consecutive school years. He had eaten cereal for dinner more evenings than he could count, sitting at a kitchen table under fluorescent light, while his father slept between shifts. Somewhere around age 12, he had made himself a promise that was less a promise than a command issued inward. He would never, under any circumstances, be the kind of man the world could afford to overlook. He had kept that command for 40 years, aggressively, without apology. The story Richard Harwell told about his own life went like this. I earned every dollar. Nobody handed me anything. I read people better than anyone in any room I have ever heard, and I have never lost at anything that genuinely mattered. Mostly true. That was the dangerous part. Mostly true is enough to build a whole architecture of belief around, and Richard Harwell had been living inside that architecture for 30 years, without anyone managing to put a crack in a wall. He had started to believe the architecture was the truth, rather than a version of it. He liked chess because chess confirmed the story. You could not buy a win at chess, could not charm one or delegate one or restructure one through an attorney. You sat across from another person, and either your thinking was better than theirs or it was not. Harwell's thinking had always been better. Yale Intercollegiate Champion, 1987. Undefeated in this house for 20 years. He had dismantled hedge fund managers, a state senator with a reputation, and a semi-professional player who drove in from Westchester one evening thinking it would be a pleasant way to spend a Thursday. It had not been pleasant. Not for the other man. On the wall of his study, between the window and the door, there was a photograph. Two young men at chess, college age. One of them was holding a trophy. The other stood slightly to the left, hands sides, looking at the camera with an expression that was difficult to read from across the room. Harwell's was the one not holding the trophy. No guest ever asked about that photograph. Harwell never explained it. The sword itself sat under a brass gallery lamp in the center of the study. Walnut and maple, hand-carved pieces commissioned from a craftsman in Vermont who kept a 6-month waiting list and didn't apologize for it. The position suits a display was from a famous championship match, a teaching position. The kind that revealed everything about how a person thought about chess if they looked at it long enough and honestly enough. Harwell looked at most English teams. He had never once gotten the night wrong. Her name was Renee Carter. She took the 5:40 train from Bridgeport every morning, 40 minutes each way in the dark, going out, and in the dark coming back. She arrived before the household woke, and she left after it had settled into evening. And in between those 2 points she cleaned 12 bedrooms that nobody sleeps lammy regularly, and polished silver that nobody used except for specific occasions, and managed the invisible infrastructure of a life she would never live herself. 6 years of this. Her hands were cracked from bleach and cold water, cracked in the way that lotion helped temporarily, and rest would have helped more, but rest was not part of the schedule. Her lower back ached in a way she had long since stopped mentioning it to anyone because mentioning it had never fixed it, and she still had to be on the 5:40 regardless of what she mentioned. She was 41 years old and had spent the better part of those years being invisible to people who had money, which was its own particular education. Richard Harwell had never called her by name, not once in 6 years. It was always you, said in a direction, or a look that carried the same instruction. Once, at a dinner party in the 3rd year, a guest had knocked a wine glass off the terrace railing. It fell 12 feet and landed on the stone below with a sound that nobody came to investigate. The cost appeared as a deduction on Renee's next paycheck. No conversation preceded it. No explanation followed it. She found out at the bank on a Friday afternoon when her balance was wrong by exactly that amount. She came back on Monday at 5:40. Because that was the job, and the job was the plan. And the plan had a name, and his name was Elias. Elias had been 8 years old the first time he came to the estate. Too young to leave alone in Bridgeport for a full working day. No money for after-school programs. And Renee had worked out an arrangement with the house manager that her son would sit quietly in the staff kitchen until she was finished. She had explained the rules on the bus ride over, holding his face with her eyes the way she did when something was not a suggestion. Stay in the corner. Stay quiet. Don't touch anything. Don't look at anything longer than it takes to walk past it. Don't give anyone a reason to notice you're there. He had understood. Not just the words, the weight they carried, and the reason for the weight. So Elias made himself small. He was good at it. Better than most children his age, and most children his age had not had the same education in the matter. He sat on his stool by the pantry with his library book and became furniture. Staff moved around him. Cater stepped past him without registering his presence. Harwell walked through the kitchen once a week without ever acknowledging that a child was sitting 3 feet from the refrigerator, which suited Elias completely. He was learning things, not just from the books, though the books were good, and his grades were consistently better than good. He was learning the other curriculum, the one that operated in the spaces between people when they assumed no audience was present. That powerful people talked differently when they believed no one was watching them. Softer sometimes, meaner at other times. He learned that the same person could defist at a dinner table and dismissive in a service hallway and appear not to notice the distance between those two versions themselves. He learned that money made certain people genuinely kinder, made others simply more comfortable about showing what they had always been underneath the performance. He watched all of this from his stool. He said nothing. He filed everything. His grandfather had taught him to watch. Joseph Carter. Everyone who had ever known him called him Pops. Doorman at the Meridian Hotel in Midtown Manhattan for 38 years, through administrations and recessions, a specific foot, decades that wears some men down and gives others a particular quality of stillness. Black suit, white gloves, a face that had absorbed more of New York City than most people who wrote about New York City and had commented publicly on almost none of it. On Saturdays, Pops went to Marcus Garvey Park in Harlem and sat at the stone chess tables and played anyone willing to sit across from him. $5 a game. College students, working men on their day off, club players looking for a casual afternoon, once a touring player who came through the city on his way to a regional tournament, stopped smiling after the 12th move, and went very quiet after the 15th, and shook Pop's hand afterward without speaking. Pops won, gave the man his $5 back. He never played a rated tournament. Entry fees cost money, and money went to rent to Renee, to the ordinary expenses of us alive that didn't leave much after the ordinary expenses were handled. The chess world never learned his name. The park knew him. The stone tables knew him. On Saturday mornings, that was enough, or it had to be, and Pops had long ago made his peace with what had to be. He started teaching Elias when the boy was 5, not as a pastime, as something more serious, though he never said so directly. Pops was not a man who explained his reasons when the reasons were important. He taught by sitting down and moving pieces and talking while he moved, not about openings or endgames at first, but about the logic underneath the game, the way each piece had a personality if you paid attention. This night, he would zoobs like it's thinking sideways. Don't try to predict it. Try to understand how it's the board. This bishop only sees half the squares and is completely certain it sees everything. You know people like that. Elias did not know people like that at age 5. By age 10, he had encountered several, every Saturday for 6 years, rain or shine, cold or warm. Pops with his thermos of cloth buff black coffee, which he held in both hands between moves as though warming something more than his palms. Elias with his library book in his bag and his eyes on the pieces. And the specific attention of a child who has said this particular thing is worth more than anything else available on a Saturday morning. Pops taught openings the way a patient man then teaches fishing, with stories attached and no hurry attached, and the understand succeeding that some knowledge has to be absorbed rather than received. He taught endgames on a bulletin board that had this top lost upon somewhere in the years before Elias arrived. They replaced with a bottle cap from a soda can, and never thought to change. He taught Elias to develop pieces before attacking, to castle early and mean it, to make every move justify the square it occupied. And above everything else, woven through 6 years of Saturday mornings like thread through cloth, one lesson that returned in different form so many times it stopped sounding like instruction and started sounding like weather. Something simply true, the way certain things are true before you have the language to explain why. The board doesn't ask your name, son. Doesn't ask your zip code or what your family has in the bank. 64 squares, same pieces on both sides. It's the only fair place I've ever found in this country. So when you sit down equal. Elias absorbs the way children absorb the things that will shape them, completely. Without knowing it was happening, without being able to point to the moment, it became part of how he understood the world. By 11s, he was beating everyone at the stone tables except Pops himself. One October afternoon, cold enough that their breath made small, separate clouds above the board, Pops studied his grandson for a long moment without moving a piece. Something moved through his eyes, not pride exactly, or not only pride, something larger than pride. The things that extast pride when you have given everything you have to something and watched it grow into more than you gave. "You're better than me, boy," Pop said. He looked back at the board. Don't tell nobody yet. That winter, Pop's heart began to fail. It happened the way those things happen. Gradually, then faster than gradually. Doctor visits that became more frequent and less optimistic. Stares then that required pauses they had not previously required. The thermos of black coffee replaced by decaf, then by green tea, then by nothing, because the doctor said nothing, and Pops was too tired to argue with the doctor the way he would have argued 10 years earlier. The last Saturday he was strong enough for the park they went. Pops moved the pieces with the careful precision of someone who knows this is the last time something will happen and wants it to be right. Elias played without rushing, not letting the old man win. Just not hurrying toward any conclusion. A few weeks later, the board came to the hospital room. Pop set it up on the blanket, with hands that had lost some of their steadiness, but none of their knowledge. He played through half a game that had no particular destination, before he stopped. Just stopped. Set his white king on a square that wasn't part of any sequence, and held it there for a moment with his thumb pressed against the crown. Then he picked it up and folded it into Elias's hand and closed the boy's fingers around it. The king was smooth. 40 years of Pop's off thumb had done that. The crown was still there, but had been worn to something softer, something more intimate than its original carved shape. Like a word you've said so many times, it starts to sound like something else, something that means more because it has been used more. Pops looked at him with eyes that were tired but not finished. Somebody's going to look at you and see nothing but a poor kid with no business being in the room. They'll make up their mind before you open your mouth. They'll laugh before you ever touch a piece. He paused to breathe. Don't argue. Don't shout. Don't try to prove anything with words, because words are what they're comfortable with, and you'll be playing their game. You let the board do the talking. The board never lies. He died on a Tuesday. Elias was 11 years old. He stood very still through the entire funeral, with the wooden king in his jacket pocket and his hands at his sides, and afterward, while everyone else went back to his grandmother's apartment for food and company, and the particular comfort of being around other people who were also grieving. Elias went to the park instead. He sat at the empty stone table where Pops had always set up first, the one nearest the path, the one with the slight chip on the floor where someone had once dropped something heavy and never repaired it. And he played both sides of his grandfather's favorite game by himself, moving pieces for both colors, thinking for both players, until the streetlights came on overhead. And someone from the neighborhood, a woman he didn't know, came and stood beside the table and told him gently that it was time to go home now. He went home. He did not go back to the park for 3 weeks. When he did, he sat at the same table and played the same game both ways, and something in the doing of it settled something in him that nothing else had touched. He couldn't have explained what it was. He was 11, but he kept going back every Saturday, and after a while, the going back became something that didn't change any more than he questioned breathing. After that, the chess went somewhere private. A donated laptop from a school technology drive. Screen cracked in the bottom right corner, in a pattern that looked like a small lightning bolt. Free chess websites. A username he chose in about 30 seconds without overthinking it. Stone Table 11. He played after his mother went to sleep. Screen brightness turned all the way down so the light wouldn't show under his door in the quiet of a Bridgeport apartment at midnight when the city was doing its late-night thing outside and inside. Everything was still. He played the way some people play. Alone. Seriously. With the full weight of something unnameable behind every move, something he couldn't have described to anyone and didn't try to. 3 years. More than 10,000 games. He studied grandmasters lists his classmates, studied lyrics to songs they wanted to know without looking them up. Replaying games, move by move, until the patterns weren't something he thought about consciously, but something his hands understood before his brain had finished asking the question. Until the right move arrived as a feeling rather than a calculation, which is where all serious chess eventually lives. By 14, his online rating was 2,388. That number placed him in territory that most adults who played chess seriously and consistently for years never reached. He entered a few unofficial tournaments at the local library branch, small events run on Saturday afternoons, with no FIDE registration and no rating points attached. He used a different name. He won all of them, sometimes in under 20 moves, always without saying much afterward. He changed and packed up and rode the bud home and didn't mention it to anyone. He had developed a specialty by then, something that had emerged gradually from thousands of games and had solidified into something close to a signature. He hunted aggressive players, the ones who launched their queen across the board in the first few moves, grabbed pawns like they were seizing physical territory, played a chess the way certain men moved through rooms, assuming that's a force of co-presence accomplished what force of thought was supposed to accomplish. He had built a private collection of traps for exactly that kind of opponent over 3 years of midnight games and careful study. Patient traps, constructed slowly, designed to look like mistakes until the moment they revealed themselves as something else entirely. He had never used them against anyone who hopefully deserved them. Not yet. His mother never knew. Not about the rating, not about the tournaments. She saw the laptop and assumed homework. She saw the concentration and assumed studying. She wasn't wrong about the effort or the seriousness, only the subject. Chess was the last room in the world where his grandfather was still alive. The piece is still the weight of Pop's hands. The patterns still carefree down of his voice on Saturday mornings over a thermos of coffee. Elias was not ready to share that room with anyone. Not yet, maybe not for a long time. So he kept it, and the keeping of it became its own kind of preparation, though he didn't know that yet either. 1 week before the party, while at the public library after school working on an assignment, Elias found himself in the periodicals section, pulling old issues of a chess magazine that the lie crept in bound volumes going back 15 years. He wasn't entirely sure why. He had not planned to. He found what he was looking for in an issue from 6 years back, an interview. A profile of Arthur Kempe, Grandmaster, one of the highest-rated American players of the previous 2 decades, recently retired from tournament play, but still active in coaching and commentary. 2/3 of the way through the interview, a paragraph that made him read more slowly. The interviewer had asked about memorable losses. Kempe had said that most losses teach you something about your own weaknesses, which makes them useful, even when there was one loss, he said, that had taught him something different. An old man at a park in Harlem, 1989. Kemp had been 26 years old, already ranked, already building what the next 2 decades would be built on. He had gone to Marcus Garvey Park on a Saturday afternoon because someone had mentioned the stone tables, and he had a few free hours before a tournament dinner. Les, an old man, sat down across from him, Kempy said. Didn't introduce himself. Just set up the pieces and looked at me across the board. 21 moves later, I was looking at a position I couldn't get out of. I don't lose in 21 moves. I hadn't lost that quickly in 3 years. The interviewer asked what happened after. I tried to pay the bet, Kempe said. He waved it off. I asked him why he didn't play rated tournaments. He said the entry fees were money he didn't have. I nodded, said that made sense. And then I left and played my tournament and won it, and thought about that afternoon in the park more times than I've admitted to anyone. Elias read the paragraph twice. He thought about it on the bus home. He thought about it lying in the dark that night, after the laptop was closed and the apartment had gone quiet and at Bridgeport outside was doing the particular thing it did after midnight, which was get very still, in a way that felt like the whole city was also lying in the dark, with something it couldn't quite finish thinking about. He was close to understanding something, not quite there. Almost. The invitation went out on a Thursday. Heavy cream cardstock with gold lettering that caught the light. Harwell Capital had crossed $4 billion under management, and Richard Harwell was throwing a party for 200 people to make certain that every person on East Seaboard who mattered to him knew it. 200 guests. Senators and fund managers and a chef brought in from a Manhattan restaurant, with a 3-year wait list who arrived with his own equipment and 3 assistants. White roses stacked in the front hall from floor to the base of the chandelier. String lights across the back lawn in patterns that looked deliberate from above and accidental from below, which was the whole point. All week, the estate transformed around Renee, who was working double shifts and moving through the organized chaos of major event preparation the way she moved through everything in that house. Efficiently, without drawing attention to the efficiency. Getting things done in ways that nobody thought to attribute to her. Elias had nowhere to be while his mother worked the extra hours, which meant on the night of the party he would be in the staff kitchen, on his stool, with his library book. Head down, quiet. Touch nothing. He told himself he was fine with that arrangement. For 3 hours on the night of the party, he was. The ballroom held 200 of the wealthiest people in the Northeast, drinking champagne under 3 chandeliers and talking about money in the abstract way that people, with enough of it, talk about money, not as a substance, as a way of keeping score in a game that has no finish line, which is perhaps the most exhausting game there is. Richard Harwell moved between his guests like a man who had been practicing this exact form of belonging his entire life, collecting congratulations with the ease of someone who had been expecting them, sustaining the right kind of laughter at the right intervals, being precisely what this room had always expected him to be. He was very good at it. He knew he was very good at it. That was, if you watched carefully enough, the seed of the problem. In the staff kitchen, Elias sat on his stool, library book open, brown paper bag with the sandwich his mother had packed before the evening started, the wooden king in his left jacket pocket which he had carried everywhere since Pops died, not as superstition, but as weight. The right kind of weight. The kind that reminds you where you came from when the place you're sitting in makes you want to forget. He read his book. He was fine. He was fine for 3 hours, until the kitchen manager came through, without slowing down, and pointed in his direction. You, take this tray. Go. Elias moved through the party the way he had always moved through the Harwell estate, without drawing attention. Zai's eyes rolled just enough downward to navigate without appearing to watch anything. He was always watching. He delivered 3 sets of glasses to different corners of the ballroom, collected 2 empty trays, made it through the main room and across the terrace, and back through the east corridor without anyone's attention landing on him for longer than the second it took to lift something off his tray. He was almost past the study. The doors stood open for the party. The board glowed under the brass lamp in the darker room on a threshold. The pieces stood in their display. The famous championship ranged arrangement that had been set up for the evening. The knight was in the wrong square. Not by much. Once square. But one square broke the logic of the entire position, changed every threat and counter-threat, made it a different game than what was supposed to represent. Elias had known this position since he was 9 years old. The error registered in him the way a wrong note registers in someone who has heard the right one enough times. His feet stopped. 5 seconds. 6. Standing in the threshold, looking at a mistake on a board that had nothing to do with him, feeling the pull of it. The specific, almost physical discomfort of something being wrong in the way of the ability to fix. He looked over his shoulder, then reached out and moved the one square to the left. The sound was small, wood on wood. The position made sense again. Interesting. The voice came from behind him. Unhurried, calm, not startled and not accusatory. The voice of someone who had been standing there long enough to watch the whole thing and had decided to say something rather than nothing. Elias turned. Just inside the doorway. Silver hair that had come early and was now simply part of how he looked. A gray suit that had been expensive in the way that doesn't need to announce itself. A glass of soda water held loosely. Eyes that were paying close attention while appearing to pay none. He looked at the corrected knight. Then at Elias. The way you look at something you weren't expecting to find, and are deciding what to do with the finding. Most people get that knight wrong, the man said. Even people who should know better. He wasn't directing it anywhere in particular. Or he was directing it at Elias in the way of someone who doesn't need a response to understand that one has been given you didn't. Elias picked up his tray and walked out before anything else could happen. He didn't ask the man's name, didn't look back. His heart was moving faster than the situation seemed to call for, and he spent the bus ride home trying to understand why and not quite managing it. He would understand it later. When he got home, his mother read his face the way she always read it, completely and without effort. You touched something. She was at the stove, not looking at him. It was not a question. Elias started to explain. The night. The song square. The position that had been broken and then correct again. She turned and looked at him with the specific expression that 6 years in that house had made very precise. Not angry. Not frightened. Just absolutely clear about something. In that house, she said, we don't correct rich men. We don't get noticed. Head down, hands to yourself. We do our work and we come home safe. You understand me? Yes, ma'am. He meant it. Elias Carter had no intention of being noticed by anyone in that house. He wanted his stool and his library book and the arranged to continue exactly as it had been arranged. There was a plan, and the plan was working, and there was no good reason to alter it. But the man in the gray suit had seen him. Something about that refused to sit still. 3 weeks later, the party arrived. Through the estate's front gates came 2 guests' cars, one that cost more than most people's houses. Through the service entrance came Renee Carter at 5 in the morning and Elias Carter at 4 in the afternoon. And the arrangement was what it had always been. Stool, book, corner, quiet. He was fine. He was fine until the kitchen manager pointed and said, "You, take this tray, go." And Elias walked into the ballroom with a tray of glasses and eyes, aimed at the floor, and everything exactly as his mother had taught him. And then he walked past the open study doors, and the board was lit up under the brass lamp, and the knight was in the wrong square again, and his feet stopped before his judgment could catch up with them. 5 seconds. Then the voice. Well, look at this. Harwell's voice cut through the hallway and carried into the ballroom the way his voice always carried, because rooms like that one had been acoustically designed for carrying, and Richard Harwell had spent 30 years learning exactly how to use a room. He stood in the wide doorway with a scotch in one hand and an expression that had found what it had been waiting all evening for. Behind him, curious guests pressed in, a dozen faces at first, then more. The specific energy of a crowd that senses something is about to happen at someone else's expense. The helps Kid, Harwell said. Studying my board. Laughter moved through the crowd easily, the way laughter moves when it doesn't require any thought. He reached into his breast pocket, peeled a bill from a money clip without checking the denomination. A 20. He held it between two fingers for a moment, displaying it briefly, and then he tossed it. The bill turned in the air, floated, and landed on the marble floor between them with a flat, dry sound that was somehow larger than it should have been given how so small the bill was. Pick it up, Harwell said. That's more than your kind earns using their brain. Elagas looked at the bill on the marble. Then he looked at Harwell. He did not move. The silence went 5 seconds. 6. Long enough for the laughter to run out and something else to move into the space where it had been. And gathered guests, Renee appeared. She had heard the laughter from 3 rooms away and known. The particular quality of that laughter had told her everything. She had come quickly without running, which was its own skill, and whilst now she stood at the back of the crowd with her hand half raised toward something she could not reach. A voice from somewhere in the middle of the gathering, a man who had been enjoying his second glass of champagne and found this particular moment amusing. Careful, Richard. Maybe the boy plays, and there it was. The thing Harwell's entire evening had been unconsciously building toward, an audience, a stage, a moment that would let everyone in the room see what he was. He spread his arm. You know what? He said. Tonight I'm feeling generous. 1 game. The kid beats me and I write him a check for $1 million. He held the pause while the room gave him the sound he wanted. He loses, Harwell continued, and he and his mother pack their things tonight. They don't come back. Renee pushed through the crowd, her tray still in her hands because she had not had time or thought to put it down, her voice working to stay steady. Mr. Harwell, please. He's 14 years old. We don't want any trouble, please. Then your boy should keep his eyes off my things. Elias looked at his mother, at her hands on the edge of the tray, at 6 years of 540 trains and cracked hands and swallowed responses condensed into one woman standing in a doorway, asking him to be decent and receiving nothing of the kind. He put his hand in his jacket pocket, found the wooden king, found the crown, worn smooth by 40 years of patience that had never been publicly rewarded and had never stopped being applied. He pressed his thumb against the way the Pops had pressed his thumb against it and felt the weight of it, and thought about a rainy Saturday morning at a stoned table in Harlem. Don't argue. Don't shout. You let the board do the talking. Elias. Okay, he said. 1 game. The room came apart. Applause, laughter, movement. Someone calling for the board to be brought out. The sound of a crowd that believed it already knew how this story ended. Harwell raised his glass. You hear that, everyone? The helps kid accepts. He was grinning the grin of a man who has never been wrong about anything in this room. This won't take long. He was right about the length. He had the wrong person's count in mind when he said it. Because what nobody in that ballroom understood, including the man with the money clip and the $50,000 board, was where Elias Carter had spent every Saturday of his childhood, who had been waiting there. What those Saturdays had built in him, slowly and without announcement, the way the most important things are always built. Board was being carried out from the study. The chandelier light touched the edges of the pieces, and through the crowd near the back wall, moving without hurry, came the man in the gray suit with the silver hair. He set his soda water on a passing tray. He walked toward the center of the room the way someone walks toward something they have been waiting without knowing they were waiting. This, Elias recognized him. The man from the study doorway 3 weeks nexo. The man from the paragraph in the chess magazine. The only loss I never forgot. Elias didn't fully understand yet what that meant. He was about to. That was how long Elias had before the board was arranged, and 200 people, and however many strangers on a phone screen, watched him either prove something or lose everything his mother had spent 6 years holding together one early morning at a time. 2 minutes, Renee pulled him into the kitchen hallway, her hands on his shoulders, her face close to his. The noise from the ballroom pressed through the walls with the weight of something that had its own momentum now and wasn't going to stop, regardless of what they decided in this hallway. "Baby," she said. "Listen to me." He listened. "We can walk out right now. Tonight. I'll find another position. We've done hard before. We know how to survive hard. You don't need to do this." Her hands were not steady. Not from fear, exactly. From the effort of holding everything in its place, while the seams pulled in every direction at once, and there was only one of her to hold all of it. Elias looked at her, and felt something he had not anticipated. Not nerves about the game. The game was the one place in his life where nerves had never followed him. Not stage fright. Something that sat lower and was harder to name. Fear about winning. Because here is what nobody considers when they imagine in the moment of beating someone powerful. What comes after the moment? The ride home on the train, the next morning, the next week. The way people with money and reach absorb a public humiliation privately and find ways to express it that are slow and quiet and very difficult to trace back to their source. Renee still needed work. The apartment in Bridgeport was still a real place with real rent and real heat bills. What did $1 million actually buy if it cost something that couldn't be replaced? He stood in the hallway and he genuinely didn't know. Then he stopped thinking about it. Not because the fear disappeared. It didn't leave. But his hand found the wooden king in his pocket, and his thumb found the crown. And something came back to him that wasn't quite a memory. More like the feeling underneath a memory. The weight of a specific Saturday in October at a stone table, with his breath making small clouds above the board, and an old man looking at him with eyes that were both very tired and very present. The board doesn't ask your name. It only asks your move. Elias looked at his mother. "I know we can walk out," he said. He straightened up. "But I'm not going to." Renee looked at her son's face for a long moment, 14 years old. Still certain in a way that reminded her of some she had not stopped missing, and was not going to stop missing. She let go of his shoulders. She nodded once. They walked back toward the noise together. The staff had cleared a table in the center of the ballroom, directly under the largest of the 3 chandeliers, and 2 men were carrying the Vermont board out the sultry fahama with the deliberate care of people who had been told twice that what they were carrying cost $50,000 and had taken the information seriously. Guests pressed in from every direction. A wall of formal clothes and raised champagne glasses and phones. The phones were everywhere now. Lifted above shoulders, angled for better sight lines, red recording lights blinking in the warm dimness of the room, like a field of small, patient eyes that didn't need to blink. Someone had started a live stream 9 minutes ago. 40 viewers when they opened it. Nobody in this room knew that number was about to become something else entirely. Douglas Mercer stood the far windows, slightly apart from the main crowd. Heavyset. A suit that was expensive in the way that has nothing to prove. He had $800 million of pension fund money sitting in Harwell Capital. Teachers, firefighters, people who had spent 30 years showing up to work and had handed the accumulated result of that work to someone else to manage because they had run out of years to manage it themselves. Mercer watched the table being arranged with the stillness of a man who measures this everything and celebrates very little. He was not smiling. He was watching Harwell's face. Arthur Kemp moved through the crowd without disturbing it and came to rest a few feet from the table. He stood with ease of someone who has been in important rooms often enough that the importance no longer affects his posture. He said nothing. He looked at the board with the expression of someone recognizing something they have thought about before, in a different context, a long time ago. Harwell saw him across the table. "Arthur," he said, expanding the moment, "if there's real money on this, we should have someone neutral, someone the room recognizes." He turned to the nearest group of guests and began to introduce Kempe in the way he introduced anyone who served a purpose, which was to say efficiently and with emphasis on the parts that reflected well on the person doing the introducing. Kempe set his soda water on a passing tray. He looked at the board, then at Elias. Something passed through his eyes that the room was not positioned to see. "All right," he said. He stepped to the side of the table and spoke in a voice that was measured to carry to every corner of the room, without sounding as though it was trying to. "State the terms, Richard." "Throw it in here." Harwell loved this. He believed Kemp was constructing a better stage for him. $1 million to the boy if he wins, Harwell said. "If he loses, he and his mother leave my employment and my property tonight." Kempy nodded, witnessed. He said it so the way you say something that is now part of the permanent record. The 200 people in the room. Dozens of phones already recording. A live stream that had been running for 11 minutes and had just rolled it past 400 viewers without anyone noticing. Harwell settled into his chair across from the boy and turned the board so he had white. He always had white. He looked across at Elias with the settled confidence of a man in his own house, about to do something he was many times before. "First lesson," he said. "Free of charge. White moves first." Elias said nothing. He sat down. He centered his pieces on one by one, touching each soldier before placing it, knowing where everyone lived before the battle started. The way Pops had insisted on it from the first Saturday onward. "Touch each one on," he had said. "Know where everyone lives before you ask them to do anything." He knew. Move one. Harwell pushed his king's pawn forward, 2 squares. The piece struck the board with the confidence of a declaration. 2 guests nearest the table actually applauded the opening move, as though pushing a pawn were the kind of thing that deserved recognition. Elias answered before the sound of the applause had faded. Pawn to meet pawn. The oldest reply. Center against center. 3 seconds of apparent consideration, perhaps less. "Fast hands," Harwell said. "Fast hands lose fast." The crowds gave him a small laugh, the automatic kind, the kind that proximity to power produces even when the joke doesn't quite earn it. Move 2. The queen came out. Harwell swung her diagonally across 4 squares, aimed at the weakest point on the black king side. The square defended only by clogging the king's himself. A scholar's mate attempt. 4 moves to checkmate if the opponent didn't know it was coming. A trap designed for people who were new to the game and no one else. Someone near the back of the crowd who understood what they were watching leaned toward the person beside them. "He's going for the quick kill," they said quietly. 4-move trap. "The kid will be fine if he's seen it before." Elias looked at the queen sitting aggressive and exposed on her new square. He smiled, not at Harwell, at the board. The private smile of someone who has heard a particular joke enough times that it still lands as a joke, but no longer requires any visible reaction beyond simple recognition. His knight came out. 1 move accomplishing 2 things at once without announcing either. It blocked the mating threat and planted a piece on a strong central square. 4 seconds. At the side of the table, Kempa stopped watching the board and started watching the boy, because he had seen that exact reply in 10,000 serious games, and he had almost never seen it from someone sitting at a party game. Amethyster panicked when a queen moved toward their king. They pushed pawns in front of it like desperate barricades. They flinched, they overcorrected. They gave a Dilvis Clumpo trying to solve a problem that hadn't fully developed yet. This boy had not flinched. The knight didn't only defend. It occupied the center and looked across the board with a question that was quiet and almost polite. "And now what?" Move 3. Harwell built developed bishop. Long diagonal, aimed toward the black king's position. He checked his watch and tilted it so the person to his left could read it. 3 moves, he said. From ending this, he looked out at the assembled guests. "Anyone want to arrange the boy's transportation home? He'll be leaving shortly." Laughter. Real this time. Full. The crowd was entertained and Harwell was in his element, and everything was proceeding exactly as he had imagined it when he made the offer. In the back of the crowd, Renee stood with both hands wrapped around the strap of her apron. Her lips moved slightly. Not prayers exactly. Something older than organized prayer. The thing you fall back on when you have run out of things you can control and all you have left, is the hoping. Elias made his 3rd move. A pawn, not toward the center, sideways quietly to the edge of action. It appeared to accomplish nothing, except it left Onding completely alone and unprotected, sitting directly in the path of Harwell's queen, like something carelessly abandoned there. A gift, right there in the open. The man, who had been whispering to the person beside him, groaned quietly. Oh no, the kid just left a pawn hanging. Just left it sitting there. Harwell saw it immediately. His expression softened into something satisfied and almost warm. He reached for his scotch. He was enjoying himself now in the specific way you enjoy yourself when something you expected to be difficult has decided to be cooperative. Susser, you see that, everyone? He gestured at the board with the glass, the gesture of a professor pointing to an example that proves the point he has been making all semester. That is what happens when someone sits down at a table they have no business being at. His hand moved over the queen. I almost feel bad, he said. He didn't feel bad. That was clear to anyone watching. At the side of the table, Kempe's eyes narrowed by an amount so small that only someone looking directly at him would have noticed. He had seen the hanging pawn. He had also, in the same moment, seen what surrounded it, the specific arrangement of pieces that looked scattered until you understood the geometry connecting them, the angles, the distances, the lanes that would open in 2 or 3 moves if white went where the pawn was inviting white to go. He had seen something like this once before. 21 moves in a park in Harlem. An old man with white gloves who waved off the $5 bet afterward. Under the table, Elias's thumb moved across the crown of the wooden king. The trap his grandfather had taught him on a rainy Saturday at the stone tables the one Pops had described with the image of a wolf following Maid in the canyon was open and ready. Built over 3 moves, piece by piece, in the way that traps are never built by announcing themselves. You build them by making the other person believe they are the hunter. All it needed was an arrogant man's hand on a queen. Move 4. Harwell took the pawn. He moved his queen to the defended square and lifted the captured pawn and held it between 2 fingers, turning it briefly toward the people nearest the table the way you hold up a small trophy that confirms what everyone suspected. 1 down, he said. The rest coming soon. Applause from several people near the front. Someone in the back actually whistled. What he did not see was almost no one saw except the silver-haired man standing very still at the side of the table was where his queen now stood. Deep in enemy territory. Far from her king. Far from every piece that might come to her assistance. Positioned on squares that a 14-year-old boy had spent 3 moves quietly arranging around her. Pops used to explain it to the men who lost their $5 at those tables and wanted to understand afterward. You don't catch a wolf by chasing it, he would say. You catch it by making it hungry. You leave something on the ground, 1 piece at a time, each piece a little deeper into the canyon. The wolf thinks it's winning the whole time. It thinks it's the cleverest animal in the valley. Right up until the moment it turns around and sees how far it walked in. And the walls, Elias answered without hesitation. His second knight stepped out. No announcement. It settles on a square that appeared to threaten nothing visible. But it aimed at a square 3 moves into the future with the precision of something that had been planned from the beginning. Kemp took a breath that was not quite audible. Move 5. Harwell took another pawn. His queen moved again, deeper fertile, collecting a pawn from the side of the board. 2 pawns ahead now. Material count favored the billionaire. 2 guests near the front clinked their glasses together. The queen was further from home than she had ever been, Elias answered. His dark squared bishop slid out along the diagonal and settled on a square where it appeared to threaten nothing in particular. Kempe's eyes tracked the angle immediately. The bishop was pointing down a long road toward Harwell's king, past ranks of unmoved pieces, toward a king that still stood in the open center of the board with nothing built around it, not threatening yet. Pointing. Count the black pieces with purpose now. 1 knight holding central ground, a 2nd knight aimed at a future square that nobody else in the room had identified. A bishop with a long diagonal, and the black queen still on her starting square, untouched, patient, like weather that has decided not to hurry. Harwell waved for more scotch without taking his eyes off the board. Move 6. For the first time all evening, Richard Harwell actually thought. He stared at the position, not performing consideration, actually doing it. The room noticed the silence where the rhythm of quick moves and confident commentary had been. 30 seconds, then 45, then a full minute. Something was happening behind his eye. It started as arithmetic and shifted toward recognition. The specific unwilling recognition that arrives when you have been telling yourself one story about a situation, and the situation has been quietly telling a different one, and the two versions have just come close enough together that you can no longer pretend you don't see the gap. His queen was 2 pawns richer and completely stranded. His knights hadn't moved. His bishops hadn't moved. His king stood unprotected in the center of the board. The polices, when had they all gotten out, when exactly had that happened, were arranged in a pattern Harwell almost recognized. Almost. There had been a book, his Yale Years, a collection of annotated games from a Soviet-era player who had made a career of a specific construction. A queen hunt, the annotations called it. Not a direct attack. Something more architectural. Something that invited the opponent's most powerful piece into an open space and then closed the space slowly, while developing everything else until the queen was not attacking anything but simply lone somewhere far from home. He had skimmed the chapter 30 years ago. He almost remembered the warning at the end of it. The room had changed its quality. People who had been chatting between moves had stopped. The shift was subtle but real. The way temperature changes in a room, and you can't name the moment, but you feel the difference. Taking your time, Richard, someone called. The friendly kind of observation that lands like a question. The laugh that answered was thinner than the ones before. Harwell moved. He pulled his queen back 1 square, a retreat arranged to look like repositioning, the first backward movement of the night. And here is where the real story of this evening actually lives. Not in the checkmate, not in the money. Here, in this moment, in this decision, the part of Richard Harwell that had genuinely earned that Yale championships, the part that had actual ability before other things had entered the equation. That part was clear. Get the queen back. Regroup. You can still fix. The other part, the part that had spent 20 years winning dinner party games in this room, the part that needed 200 people to watch him win. Not in front of everyone. He pushed forward. That was the choice. Not the move, the choice. The moment Richard Harwell decided that how he appeared to the room mattered more than what the board was showing him. A decision made in less than a second by a part of himself he had been obeying for 30 years without once examining it. Elias answered in 4 seconds what his kings castled. The rook slid sideways like a bolt sliding home, smooth and certain. King protected behind a wall of pawns. The rook looking down an open file toward the center of the board. Everything connected, nothing wasted. The position of someone who had known where they were going since the first move. At the edge of the spectators, a portfolio manager turned to Bay and spoke quietly. Level with me, Arthur. The kid's been getting lucky. Harwell can bring the queen back and equalize. Right? Kemp did not move his eyes from the board. Luck moves fast and thinks slow, he said. That boy is doing the opposite. A pause. I've seen this construction before, in serious tournament play. The queen isn't out of position by accident. She's been herded there, 1 move at a time. Every move that looked passive was a wall going up. He paused again. He isn't defending, Kempe said. He's been hunting since move 1. The word traveled through the front rows in seconds. From there it moved outward through the crowd the way whispers move in enclosed spaces, which is faster than almost anything else. People who had been smirking started narrating quietly into their phones. The live stream had been running for 23 minutes and had just passed 15,000 viewers in Bridgeport, in Harlem. In a barbershop in Queens, where someone had cast their phone to the television on the wall. Strangers were starting to find a borrowed jacket, sit across from a man worth $4 billion, and not look away. And Renee Carter, standing at the door she had walked through 5 mornings a week for 6 years, had stopped moving her lips. She was watching her son's face, completely still. Not performing calm, actually calm. The way the stone tables in the park were calm, absorbed as ever happened on their surface without registering it as disturbance. Like the game was the only room in the building, and the 200 people around it were outside it looking in. She knew that face. Not from her son, from her father. Her hand rose to cover her mouth. All those Saturdays, all those years. The laptop light under his door. The library books she had thought were just library books. The tournament she had known nothing about. She wasn't watching a boy in trouble. She was watching her father's last lesson, played out loud in the middle of a ballroom she had cleaned 100 times. Move 7. The move the room would not stop talking about. Ecleus looked at the position for a moment that felt longer than it was. He wasn't calculating. He had calculated this 3 moves ago. He was doing something else. The thing you do before a door you are about to open when you already know what's on the other side. He reached for his knight. The first one. The piece that had come out calmly on, moved to and held its ground while everything else developed around it. He set it down deep in white territory. On a square where Harwell's pawn could capture it immediately. A free piece. Sitting there undefended and apparently unintentional, he folded his hands on the edge of the table and waited. The room made a sound, a real one. The collective intake of breath that happens when 200 people see the same thing at the same moment. He's cracking, someone said, too loudly. The pressure got to him. Harwell stared at the knight. Something moved through his expression. Relief flooding in like color, returning to something that had gone pale. The worry he had been performing his way past for the last 3 moves now had somewhere to go. A door out of the discomfort. "Thank you, boy," he said. He took the knight, placed it with the 2 captured pawns at the edge of the board. He looked at Kempe with something close to the old ease in his face. "You were saying something about hunting?" Arthur Kemp stood up. A grandmaster does not stand at a casual parody game. The people in the room who played chess understood this and went quiet first. The silence spread from them outward, the way cold spreads across still water. Person by person, layer by layer, until the room was very quiet. Kemp looked at the board. He took the full measure of every piece, every square, every angle of force, and every wall that had been constructed quietly over 6 moves, while the room was watching material count and missing everything that mattered. Then he spoke in a voice that reached every corner. "Ladies and gentlemen, 1 beat. Not for theater, for readiness. That night was not a blunder. It was an invitation. What you are watching right now is a forced checkmate. Strat designed, I believe, from the very first move of the game. 3 full Tuscans. Nobody in that ballroom breathed. Then the room changed direction. Not gradually, all at once, the way a sail changes when the wind comes from somewhere unexpected. The guests who had been laughing at the $20 bill on the marble floor pressed forward toward the phones led the way. The live stream counter spun past 40,000. Someone in the comments typed a question that would trend before morning. Who is this kid? The shift had a sound to it. The laughter was gone. In its place, something lower and more electric. The hum of 200 people simultaneously revising their understanding of the last 40 minutes and what they meant. A waiter set his tray on a passing cart and turned to watch. He did not pick it up again. The chef came out of the kitchen, apron still tied, towel over one shoulder, standing in the doorway watching over people's heads. The string quartet had stopped playing at some point. Nobody had noticed when. Douglas Mercer had not moved from his position near the windows, but his attention had shifted, away from Harwell's face, down to Harwell's hands. Harwell's hands had developed a tremor. Small, not obvious, yeah. The high-frequency kind that comes when the body has understood something the mind is still in the process of refusing to accept. Harwell could feel it. That was the specific cruelty of this moment. He could feel his own hands, and he knew the room could see them, and he knew exactly what the room was reading in what it saw. The part of him that had built $4 billion by reading rooms accurately was reading this one with complete clarity and reporting back in terms he could not misinterpret. He reached for the rope. 2 million, he said. The volume was wrong. Too loud for a man who was supposed to be in control of everything, including the temperature of his own voice. 2 million against whatever you've got. You scared, boy? The silence that followed this was a different kind of silence. The previous silence had been anticipation. This one was recognition. The recognition of what desperation sounds like when it puts on the clothes of confidence. A senator near the front found something interesting to look at on the floor. Two champagne table exchanged a look over their glasses that contained a complete and detailed conversation. Neither of them spoke aloud. Elias did not look up from the board. The bet stands, sir. 1 million. A beat. It's still your move. Behind the crowd, Renee Carter stood taller than she had stood in 6 years. Move. 8. 11 minutes. 11 minutes of Richard Harwell, staring at a position that had been closing around his king since the 6th move of a game he had announced would not take long. 63,000 people watching on screens in rooms that had nothing to do with Greenwich, Connecticut. 200 guests in his own ballroom waiting. He searched for the move that would fix it. He looked at every piece, in every square and every possible sequence, and found the same answer every time, which was that there was no sequence. He looked again, anyway, because that's what you do when the alternative is accepting what the board has been telling you, and you are not ready. At last he moved. He pushed a knight back toward his king. A bodyguard arriving after the crisis had already matured. He let go of the piece as though the square were warm. The Black Queen moved. She'd been on her starting square since the game began. Through all of it, while the board reorganized itself around her patience, while the lanes opened and the walls went up and the White King drifted, move by move, toward a corner he had not noticed becoming a corner. Elias lifted her, without rushing. Pops had never permitted pieces to be slammed or thrown or handled with anything less than the respect the game deserved. It was disrespectful to the board, and to the opponent, and to the game itself. And all three things deserved respect, regardless of what the person across the table was doing or had done. He swept her across the full length of the board. One long diagonal, clean and certain, from one side of the position to the other. She settled a saint into the center of White's arrangement with a sound that was very small. Wood on wood.
A single clay.
The sound carried in the silence the way so small sounds carry when nothing else is competing with them. Check, Elias said. Not loud, not performing it. The way his grandfather said it at the Stone Bulls. Softly, almost gently. The way you say something that's simply true. Ooh. Look at the White King now, cornered. Not by a dramatic siege, not by an overwhelming attacking force, by his own pieces, his own rook set in the corner. Furchworth moved in a hurry and forgotten there. His own pawns, never advanced far enough to do anything useful, walled him in from the front. That Tajai tried to arrive as a bodyguard had taken the last open square and blocked it. Every soldier Richard Harwell owned had become a wall of his own making. One legal move remained. The people in the room who played chess saw it simultaneously. The ones who didn't play saw it in the faces of those who did. Harwell reached for his king. His hand was shaking badly enough now that the piece rocked when he placed it on the one available square. He pressed it down with one finger until it stopped rocking, took his hand away. The king was still. Move 9. The ballroom drew itself inward. 200 people and 63,000 on screens, and the weight of an evening that none of the people present would describe the same way afterward, though they would all agree that they had been in the room when it happened. Elias looked at the board. 2 at most. He knew this move, had known it since move 6, had known the exact square and the exact geometry of the path that ended there. This was not calculation anymore. This was something else. The thing on the other side of calculation, where the answer exists in your hands before your mind has finished confirming it. His remaining knight rose, the piece that moves like an L and thinks like a knife. The piece his grandfather had, first described to him on a napkin at a diner in Harlem when he was 5 years old, drawing the shape carefully, with a pen that had almost run out of ink, explaining that some movements don't look like what they are until you've seen them enough times to recognize them. The knight moved, 2 squares forward, 1 square left. The specific geometry of an L drawn by someone who learned to draw it before they learned anything else about the game. It landed. Score for which a king in this position, so surrounded by his own pieces, enclosed by the army he had spent 9 moves misusing, had no legal move and no recourse and no one to send for help. The smothered mate, a king buried not by the enemy but by his own. Checkmate, Elias said. Not loud, not triumphant, not performing anything. The way his grandfather had always said it at the stone tables in Marcus Garvey Park. Softly, almost kindly. The way you deliver news that was always going to arrive. That the position had been announcing for several moves. That the other person could have seen coming if they had been willing to look. The ballroom went somewhere very still. Then Elias reached into his jacket pocket. He brought out the wooden king. Crown, worn by decades of his grandfather's patience and 3 years of his own. He set it on the board beside the position, facing the fallen white king in its corner. He looked at it for a moment before speaking. "This is for the man who taught me," he said, not performing it, just saying it. He played at stone tables in a park, his whole life for $5 a game. He was better than everyone in this room. Nobody ever knew his name. 3 full seconds of absolute silence. Then a single pair of hands began to applaud. Slow, deliberate, each clap distinct and separate, ringing off of the marble and the walls and finding every corner of the room before the next one arrived. Arthur Kemp, standing at his full height, applauding the way you applaud something you have been waiting for, without knowing you were waiting for a very long time. 1 beat. Then the room broke open. Waiters and senators and fund managers and women who would describe this evening to people who hadn't been present for the rest of their lives. The live stream chat filling with a single word repeated until it became its own rhythm. King, king, king. Renee crossed the floor she had cleaned for years. Nobody stepped in front of her. Nobody said a word. The crowd opened the way crowds open for someone who has earned the right to move through them without asking permission. She took her son's face in both hands. She pressed her forehead to his. The cameras caught that, all of them. And Richard Harwell sat exactly where he had been sitting alone at the center of all that noise, staring down at a 50,000 board, at a king buried by his own army. A position that had been telling him the truth since the 6th move of a game he had been certain would confirm everything he already believed about himself. The board had spoken. What it said was not the story Richard Harwell had been telling for 30 years. The applause was still rolling when Richard Harwell found his voice. "All right," he said at once, pushed back his chair and stood and said it again louder, because the first time had not produced the result he needed, and he was not San who accepted a first failure without trying again. "All right, fun's over." He straightened his jacket, reached for the grin the way a man reaches for a tool he has used so many times the motion is purely automatic. 30 years of being the person every room organized itself around. Of laughter arriving a half second before the joke, because everyone understood that anticipating Richard Harwell's humor was good for business, and failing to was not. Hell of a party trick. Kid's been coached, clearly. Some set this whole thing up. Very well done, genuinely, but let's be honest about what it was. He looked around for the laugh, for the loosening that would let everyone return to the version of the evening where he was in charge. The laugh didn't come. That was the thing about rooms like this one. The people in them had gotten where they were by reading situations accurately and early, by understanding which way something was moving before it announced its direction, by never being the last person in a room to understand what had just happened. Every person in that ballroom had understood what had just happened. And the bet, Harwell waved a hand. Loose. Practiced. The gesture of a man explaining something obvious to people who should already understand it without needing it explained. Come on. Nobody actually hands $1 million to the housekeeper's kid over a board game. It's an evening thing. Everyone here understands the difference between a genuine commitment and the kind of spirit of the thing that happens when. He looked around for someone to finish that sentence with him. 200 people looked at their hands, at the floor, at the board, at each other, at anything that wasn't Richard Harwell's face. Nobody said a word. Arthur Kempe spoke first. He didn't raise his voice. The room was quiet enough that he didn't need to. You stated the terms yourself, Richard. He was looking at the board when he said it. At the position still arranged there, the white king in its corner, the wooden king from a dead man's pocket standing beside it, clearly. For everyone present.
At my request, now he looked up.
$1 million to the boy if he wins. Those were your exact words. He won. 200 people in this room heard the terms before the game started. However many are watching on screens heard them too. He glanced toward the crowd. Someone's turned their phone screen outward so the viewer count was visible. How many now? 63,000, someone answered. The number landed on Richard Harwell the way a ceiling comes down. Kempe folded his hands. You can honor your word. Or you can explain to 63,000 people why your word means nothing the moment honoring it costs you something real. He let that sit in the air between them. In your business, Richard, he said quietly, which of those two things is more expensive? Douglas Mercer stepped out of the crowd, without announcement, without theater. A large, quiet man moving from one place to another, and the room rearranged itself around him the way rooms had always rearranged themselves over Douglas Mercer because he had never needed to ask them to. $800 million, Richard. His voice was level, not angry, not performing emotion of any kind. The voice of a man who has finished a calculation and is dealing with the result. That is what my pensioners have in your fund right now. Teachers. Firefighters. People who spent 30 years doing their work and handed the community's result of that to someone else to manage because they ran out of time to manage it themselves. They trusted your judgment. That was the transaction. He looked at Harwell with the steady attention of a man who has been watching carefully for a long time and has just confirmed the thing he was hoping he was wrong about. Tonight, I watched your judgment close. You picked a fight with a child to feel tall in front of a room full of people. You walked into a trap that a Grand Master tells us was engineered from the opening move. And when the board showed you plainly who you are in this moment, your first response was to tell the room it didn't count. One pause, brief, permanent. My office will call yours Monday. He buttoned his jacket. Turned, walked back through the crowd, which opened without a word and closed without a word, and did not look at Harwell while doing either. Harwell grabbed for what was left. Arthur, he said. Too fast, too loud. Be reasonable. We handle this privately. My attorneys draft something appropriate. A foundation, a scholarship. Something that captures the spirit of the evening without the whole situation becoming. The word you're looking for, Kempe said, is payment. He said it the way you correct an imprecision. Without heat, without pleasure. Because precision is sometimes a way of avoiding what is simply true. The word is payment. Renee Carter stepped forward. She had not been asked to speak. She had not been given an opening or an introduction. She had never in 6 years of employment in this house spoken to Richard Harwell without first being spoken to. She stepped forward anyway, not loudly. Not with her hands shaking. She had passed through shaking somewhere around the 7th move of the game, standing at the edge of the crowd watching, songs she understood better than anyone else in the room, and had come out the other side into a stillness that felt different from anything she had felt in this house before. The stillness of someone who has realized they have already lost the thing they were most afraid of losing and discovered that the losing did not finish them. Mr. Well. He looked at her. Actually looked. For what may have been the first time in 6 years, her face registered as something other than background. I have worked in this house since my son was as 8 years old. I have taken the 5:40 train every morning before this city is awake. I have cleaned rooms nobody sleeps in, and polished silver nobody loses, and managed the details of a life I will never live. And I have done it without complaint, because the work was the plan, and the plan was my son. Her voice was even, not performed. Steady in the way that things are steady when they have been held for a very long time, and the holding is finally complete. You billed me for a glass your guest broke. You took it from my paycheck without a word. I found out at the bank on a Friday when my balance was wrong by exactly that amount. I came back Monday at 5:40 because the job was the plan, and I was not going to let your carelessness take it from me. She held his gaze with the full and uncomplicated attention of someone who has nothing left to protect. You have never called by my name. Not once in 6 years. I thought sometimes about whether you knew it. She didn't look away. It's Renee Carter. She turned slightly toward her son. That young man is Elias Theodore Carter. He is my son, and he is the grandson of Joseph Carter, who spent 38 years opening doors for people who walked through them without looking at his face, and who was better at chess than anyone in this room, and whom this room will never know about and never deserved to. She looked back at Harwell one final time. We were never beneath you, sir. You simply needed us to be. The applause that followed was different from the applause after the checkmate. That had been surprise and excitement, and the release of 2 hours of held breath. This was something else. Closer to start, more deliberate. The sound of a room recognizing something it had watched happen and choosing to mark it. Kemp Ray raised his hand. Not yet. The room understood, settled, turned back toward the table. The boy had something left. Elias stood. He pushed back his chair and walked to where the $20 bill lay on the marble floor. It had been there since the beginning of the evening, since Hoss Harwell had peeled it from his money clip and tossed it toward a boy he had decided in advance was nothing, before the boy had done or said a single thing. It had remained through the entire game, through 9 moves and 11 minutes of silence, through the checkmate and the applause and the attempt to undo what had been clearly and publicly done. Nobody had touched it, not during and not after. Just a small rectangle of green paper on marble, waiting for whatever came next. Elias picked it up. He smoothed it flat with both hands, pressed the fold crisp. The careful handling of something that deserved to be handled with attention, regardless of what surrounded it. He walked back to the table. He set the bill down beside the white king in its corner. Beside the wooden king from his grandfather's pocket. 2 kings on a board, one worth $50,000. One worth nothing and everything, depending entirely on how you understood value and where you had learned to look for it. He looked at Harwell. His voice was level, not soft and not hard, not performing mercy and not performing anger. The voice of someone who has said what is true and has no interest in decorating it. You're going to need it more than I will. He wasn't performing when he said it. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't angry. He sounded like the board self, patient and certain and completely unmoved by the noise around it. The 8 seconds of footage capturing the placement of the bill, the boy's face, the words spoken without theater, would become one of the most watched pieces of video that year. Not because it was dramatic. Because it was not dramatic, because it was something that happens less often than drama and means more when it does. It was simply true. The guests left early. The valet line was quiet in the particular way that lines become quiet when punk want to be somewhere else and are maintaining the appearance of not being in a hurry. Goodbyes were brief and attached to nothing. The string quartet packed instruments and carried the cases out through the SIRS entrance without stopping to talk. The chef's team broke down the kitchen with the professional efficiency of people who understood when an event had ended regardless of the hour on the schedule. The live stream ran for another 40 minutes after Elias sat down. The viewer count kept climbing even after the ball began to get empty, because people who joined late were watching from the beginning, and people who had watched from the beginning were watching again, and people who had not watching were receiving the link from people who had. By midnight, the video had 2 million views. By morning, 9. By Sunday night, 14. The internet found the precise location of Richard Harwell's wound and named it within hours. The 9-move billionaire. It attached itself to everything. Cable news chyrons, financial message boards, the group chats of his own analysts, who sent it to each other without comment because no comment added anything to it. A financial network ran the checkmate footage beside a graph of Harwell Capital's 5-year performance. The anchor raised one eyebrow. 1 million people read the editorial without needing it explained. Elias went to school on Monday, Renee insisted. Standing in the kitchen, making oatmeal with her back straight and away. It had not been straight in years, insisting with the clear authority of a woman who has recently rediscovered something about herself that had been there all along. She had simply not had occasion to use it at its full height. School, she said, same as always. It was not the same as always. Children Elias had never spoken to were at the front entrance and filming his arrival. His algebra teacher met him at the classroom door with a chessboard and a marker and asked him to sign it. 3 talk shows called the principal's office before lunch. Reporters waited outside the gates at dismissal. A local news van parked at the curb at an angle that suggested it was planning to remain for a while. Elias walked past all of it. He gave one interview. 2 minutes. Local news. Standing on the front step of the apartment building in Bridgeport, Hap next to his mother, in the same clothes he had worn to school. In the afternoon light that made everything look specific and ordinary at the same time. The reporter asked how it felt to humiliate a billionaire. Elias thought about it, not performing the thought. I didn't humiliate anybody, he said. The position did. He just couldn't hear it warning him. The check arrived on a Tuesday. The same day of the week Pops had died 3 years before. Renee noticed the postmark immediately when she brought the mail inside and set it on the counter. She stood with the envelope for a moment before opening it. Coffee going cold beside her. Morning light coming through the kitchen window at the exact angle through a Tuesday mornings. She opened it. She looked at the number. Let herself look at it completely. Without the habit of glancing past large things to protect herself from how large they were. She let it land. Then she sat down at the kitchen table under the framed note. The one from the teacher 8 years ago, who had written that her son had a remarkable mind. The one she had framed, because it was the first time someone with authority had put into writing what she had always known. And the confirmation had mattered to her more than she wanted to admit. That note had hung on that wall through 6 years of early trains and cracked hands and a paycheck docked without explanation and the daily effort of remaining someone who came back anyway. She sat under it with a check in her hands and she cried. Not from happiness exactly, not from relief exactly, from the specific release of something that has been dealt for a very long time finally being set down. The kind of tears that come when a long thing is genuinely over and the body needs to mark the ending with something more than simply stopping. She allowed herself 5 minutes. Then she washed her face, drank her cold coffee, made 2 phone calls, and began making the plan that came after the plan. Arthur Kempe came to their apartment on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after the party. He called first and asked if he might come. Renee said yes before she had finished processing that she'd been asked. He sat at the kitchen table. In the chair Elias used for homework, under the window that looked out onto the street. He drank the coffee Renee made, and he talked to both of them without managing either of them, without performing the warmth of someone who wants something or the authority of someone positioned to give it. Just a man sitting in some kitchen, being honest about something he had been carrying for longer than he had admitted to anyone. He told them about Joseph Carter. Not everything, because he hadn't known everything. But what he had. Saturday, he said, 1989. I was 26, already ranked, already building what the next 20 years would rest on. I was in the city for a tournament, and someone mentioned the stone tables at Marcus Garvey Park, and I had an afternoon free, and I went. He looked at his coffee. An old man sat down across from me, black suit, white gloves. He didn't introduce himself, just set up the pieces and waited. 21 moves later, I was looking at a checkmate I hadn't seen coming. 14 moves. I don't lose in 21 moves. I hadn't lost that quickly in 3 years. He paused. When I offered to pay the bet, he waved it off. $5. And he waved it away like it meant nothing. And maybe it did because winning had never been the point for him. I asked why he didn't play rated tournaments. He said the entry fees were money he didn't have. Elias went very still. I nodded, Kempy said that made sense. And then I left. I had a tournament dinner. I had a schedule. I told myself I would go back to the park and find him again, and I didn't. I thought about going back, and I didn't do that either. He was quiet for a moment. Neither Renee nor Elias filled it. I read his name in the obituaries 3 years ago.
Joseph Carter.
Doorman at the Meridian Hotel for 38 years. He played chess. He had a daughter and a grandson. He looked at Elias. I should have gone back to that park in 1989. I should have offered to cover the entry fee on the top spot. It would have cost me less than my tournament dinner, and it would have changed what happened next, and I didn't think to do it, and I have thought about it ever since. Elias sat very still, and inside the stillness, something connected that had been almost connected for weeks. The paragraph in the old chess magazine. The only loss I never forgot. He looked at Kemp and understood fully, for the first time, what he had read in that library without quite knowing what he was reading. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. The understanding was visible in his face, and Kempy saw it, and they looked at each other for a moment across the kitchen table in a way that didn't require words. I'm not going to make the same mistake twice, Kemp said. Renee looked at this man sitting in her kitchen and thought about her father mentioning once, so only once, a young man with silver coming early into his hair who had shaken his hand at a stone table and looked almost pained when Pops mentioned the entry fees and then gone away. Pops had figured that was that. He had never known the young man's name. She knew it now. She didn't say anything either. Some things settle in silence and don't need to be spoken to be understood. The Mason Foundation started as a conversation at that kitchen table on a Thursday evening and became something real over the following 6 weeks. Built in the evenings after Elias finished homework, and Renee finished the phone calls that had begun filling her days in ways she hadn't expected. Named for Joseph Carter. Pops. The man who had been better than the rooms he was never invited into, who had spent 40 years being excellent in a place where excellence without the right paperwork and the right entry fee went nowhere. The purpose was specific, not a broad mission that could mean anything. Entry fees. Tournament registration costs for children from working neighborhood who played seriously and couldn't afford the ticket into the places where serious play was recognized and rewarded. That was the entire mandate. Because talent was not what the Carter family had ever lacked. The ticket been the thing. This ticket was going to be the ticket for as many children as it could find, for as long as it had the resources to father them. Kemp joined the board. He brought 40 years of knowing exactly who the gatekeepers were and how to have the conversations that opened the right doors. He brought credibility in a world where credibility was the currency that mattered. Renee ran it. She was good at it immediately, which surprised nobody who had been paying attention. 6 years of managing the invisible infrastructure of a 12-bedroom estate had given her operational abilities that most nonprofit directors spent years trying to develop. She knew how to make things work with limited resources. She knew how to hold 100 moving pieces simultaneously without losing any of them. She knew how to navigate systems designed without her in mind and find what she needed anyway. She also knew how to find the children. She said she recognized them on sight, a specific combination of ability and restraint. The way you hold yourself when you have learned that the room will not make space for you automatically, and you have decided to take up as little of it as possible while you wait for a room that will. She found them, and she paid their fees, and she did it in a way that protected their dignity at every step. Because she understood what it cost a person to need help, and she had no interest in making the help cost them something more. The Foundation's first physical project was 12 new stone chess tables at Marcus Garvey Park, arranged around the original tables, which had been there since before Elias was born. Same stone, same weight, positioned to look as though they had always been part of the same place, because in the ways that mattered they had. A small bronze plaque at the base of the original tables, not large, not designed to be noticed from a distance. For Pops. The board never lies. Renee's final act as an employee of Harwell Capital was brief and clean. She took the 5:40 train one last morning, walked through the service entrance for the final time, set her key card on the kitchen counter, left a note beside it, one line, no date, no signature because the signature was unnecessary. We quit. The help. She was home before 9. She made coffee and sat at her kitchen table and stayed there for a while doing nothing in particular. Just sitting in her own kitchen in the morning in the quiet of a day that had nothing required of it, and she let that be exactly what it was. The letter from Harwell arrived 6 weeks after the party. White envelope. No return address. Her name on the front in handwriting she didn't recognize immediately, but understood the moment she saw it. She opened it at the kitchen table. Inside a single sheet of paper. No heading, no date, no explanation or context, or anything surrounding what it contained. Renee Carter, her name, written out in full, in the center of the page, in the careful handwriting of someone who had taken time with it. Nothing before it, nothing after. She sat with it for a long time. 6 years of you and the help and the expression that substituted for both. 6 years of a paycheck docked without explanation. 6 years of 5:40 trains and invisible labor and the daily weight of being treated as furniture by someone who could not have operated without her. And now her name on a page by itself, written out, as though he needed to prove to himself that he knew it. As though it had taken the loss of a fund and the emptying of a house and 6 weeks of silence to arrive at something that should have taken 30 seconds in the first week. She folded the letter, put it in the kitchen drawer where she kept the things she wasn't finished with yet. She didn't mention it to Elias. Some things you hold alone for a while before you decide what to do with them. Sometimes a while becomes longer than that, and that's all right too. Harwell Capital did not fall apart in a single night. It came apart over 8 months, which in certain ways is harder than a clean collapse. 8 months has a rhythm, a daily quality. Mercer filed the redemption notice on Monday, as he had said he would. 3 more institutional investors followed by the end of the week. Each departure created conditions for the next, because confidence works exactly that way, and Richard Harwell understood this better than almost anyone, having spent 3 decades building an operation on that specific mechanism. He kept the estate, barely. Sold the paintings that had hung on those walls so long he had stopped seeing them as paintings and had started seeing them as wallpaper. Sold SARS, sold the watches, which hurt in a way he had not anticipated and did not examine closely. Sold the wine collection to a buyer who sent a truck on a Saturday morning and did not come himself. The Vermont chessboard went to auction in the spring. An anonymous bidder paid half its appraised value, did not negotiate, submitted the offer and paid it, and then donated the board to the chess club at a public school in Harlem. Kempe smiled in a particular way every time a reporter asked him about the anonymous buyer, not confirming, not denying. A smile that contained information without releasing it. Nobody ever proved anything. The study was bare now, everything gone. One thing remained on the wall. The $20 bill, mounted behind glass in a plain frame, centered on the largest wall in the empty room. Below it, written directly on the wall in Harwell's own handwriting, the 2 words from the letter. Renee Carter. Whether he put it there as a wound he was choosing to keep or a lesson he was trying to begin learning. Whether it was the start of understanding something or simply the end of pretending he hadn't heard it. Whether looking at it each day made him feel something he had not previously allowed himself to feel. Only he knew that. Some things are private even when they are written on a wall for no one but yourself. 1 year after the party, but a professor Swan size stood on a stage in a high school gymnasium in Hartford, Connecticut, holding a state youth chess championship trophy over his head with both hands. His first official rated tournament season. Not his first wins. He had been winning for years in rooms that didn't record it. But his first season in the books. His first season as someone the chess world could name and point to. He had not gone undefeated. He had lost twice in the regular season. Once to a 17-year-old from New Haven with 4 years of rated tournament experience and endgame technique that was several years ahead of where Elias was. Once to a quiet girl from Springfield who had built a positional style so patient it made Elias look aggressive by comparison. Both losses had produced specific hurt that comes from caring about something and coming short of it. A hurt that doesn't diminish just because you understand why it happened. Kempe had not offered comfort after either one. He had asked a question and then waited. Not for the polite answer. Not for the one designed to end the conversation and move on. For the real one. The one that required Elias to go back inside the loss and stay there long enough to find what it contained. What did you see that you missed? It was harder than winning. Much harder. Winning had become close to instinct. Learning from a loss required a different kind of attention. The patient kind. The kind that doesn't arrive naturally and has to be built the way all important things are built. That, Kemp said once, after a long and honest debrief following the Springfield game, is the actual work. Anyone can win when the position is winning. Learning what a loss is trying to tell you, actually learning it rather than just moving past it. That is what separates the people who get good from the people who get as good as they can possibly get. Most people leave the loss too soon. They take what's comfortable and go. Elias absorbed this the way he absorbed everything Kemp told him, completely, without making a show of it. And then he went home and opened the laptop and replayed the Springfield game from the beginning and stayed with it until he understood not just what had gone wrong, but why he had not seen it coming. In the front row of the gymnasium in Hartford, Kemp sat with his hands on his knees and was the first to applaud when the trophy went up, and he applauded the longest. Beside him, Srenee stood and put 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled the way she had always whistled when she was proud. At school plays when Elias had a single line. At report dinners in the years when the grades came back. And she gave herself one evening to feel it fully before returning to the business of the next thing. The whistle sounded exactly the same as it always had. Some things stay constant when everything around them changes. The best things often do. On Saturdays, Elias took the train to Harlem. He set up at the stone tables at Market Garvey Park, the new ones the foundation had installed, and the old ones that had been there since, before he existed. He played anyone who sat across from him, and he taught anyone who wanted to learn, and he took $5 a game from the people who offered it and gave half of them their money back afterward, which was not a policy he had set in advance. It was simply what you did at these tables. He understood this without having been told. One Saturday in late October, when the afternoon light in the park had gone to the particular gold that appears in New York in the fall, and stays for a few weeks before the season moves on, a child came and sat down across from him. 6 years old, a girl. 2 braids with small star-shaped barrettes at the ends. Eyes that were large and dark, and paying the kind of attention that children pay to things before they learn to be self-conscious about paying attention so openly. She placed both hands flat on the table, one on each side of the board, and waited with the complete patience of someone who has decided to be entirely present for whatever comes next. Elias set up the pieces one by one. He touched each one before placing it, knew where everyone lived before asking anything of them. He did it the way it had always been done at these tables, by the man whose name was on the plaque at the base of the old tables, whose wooden king was in Elias's jacket pocket, and would be in his jacket pocket next Saturday, and every Saturday after that for as long as he came to this park. He picked up the night. He held it where the girl could see it. Turned it in the afternoon light so she could look at the shape. the carved suggestion of movement in something that was standing still, the way it seemed to be thinking about its next position, even while occupying this one. This one's my favorite, Elias said. She looked at it with the seriousness of someone forming a considered opinion. It moves like an L and thinks like a knife. She grinned, the sudden kind that arrives before the person decides whether to let it. Elias set the knight on its square. He looked at his hand, holding the piece, and the afternoon light coming through the trees. He felt the weight of it differently than he usually felt it. Not the physical weight, which was small. The other kind. The weight of 40 years of Saturday mornings, carried in a piece of wood, and 3 more years added to that by a boy who had learned what the carrying meant. The weight of patience that had never been publicly rewarded and had never stopped being applied. He set the knight down gently. The girl was already studying the board with her full attention, which was the complete undivided attention of a 6-year-old who has decided something deserves it, which is a more serious thing than it appears. Your move, Elias said, and the game began.